Matthew chapter 5. I know the lunch was great. I will make you a deal. If you all don't to fall asleep, I won't. Turn to Matthew chapter 5. We're going to continue on. Jesus is talking about, he's given his relationship with the law. He didn't come to destroy the law. He came to fulfill it. We looked at that a few weeks ago. And then we're kind of tracking through over a few weeks here, Jesus talking through some of the parts of the law and specific ways that the followers of Christ can exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees. Last week we looked at verses 21 through 26, where Jesus talks about the sixth commandment, thou shalt not kill, and he intensifies what that is. He says, this is, but I say unto you, and as only God, the author of the law, can, he says, this is what I mean for you with this. And he goes into anger and calling them in a reproachful way, and then accusing them of this horrible sin. And then he dealing with the conflict between those who are people you have a problem with. And we looked in the afternoon time about how that kind of looks in church. So here it's talking about how you take care of your fault. And if that is dealt with, the conflicts are just done. If we admit our wrong, if we have a tender heart toward God and those things and toward men, we're just done. But in Matthew chapter 18, he talks through, well, what if someone who is in the wrong is not as forthcoming? How do you approach them on that? He's going to go on into the next part of the law here. And again, we're going to see that he emphasizes not the external actions, but the internal motivation. So if you'd stand with me, we're going to read aloud Matthew chapter 5, verses 27 through 32. So Matthew 5, verse 27 through 32. Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, thou shalt not commit adultery. But I say unto you, that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her, hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. And if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out, and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. And if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off, and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. It hath been said, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But I say unto you, that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of fornication, causeth her to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her that is divorced committeth adultery. You may be seated. Jesus has already talked on this subject of a purity a bit in verse 8. He said, blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And in a sense, if you take the opening statements of this and you totally apply them in, then the specific things about a principle like this doesn't necessarily even have to be brought up. But in all of these questions, in all of these parts of the law that Jesus is going to bring up, there's a huge potential for there to be, well, what about? Well, yeah, but, and then you get into the details of it. So Jesus is going to kind of dig into the details of them just a bit more here. I want to say with this particular topic, the topic of adultery in our culture is a huge part of our culture. And I don't mean that in the sense that it is a temptation in our culture. I mean that this sin is in many ways an element of popular culture. The concepts that Christ is going to talk through here with lust and things like that, this is a accepted part of the way people expect other humans to live. So when we're talking about this, we're not talking about just a theory, particularly. And maybe this isn't a sin that you deal with as up front or like right in your face. This is not where you are attempted the most strongly. Understanding what Christ says about this and what he wants to teach is going to be absolutely vital to you helping others in their growth. Because again, this is a part of our culture in absolutely terrible ways. I'm going to give some examples hopefully as we go through here. But this follows the pattern that we kind of set up last week. Jesus is going to give the portion of the law that he is referring to, and that starts out with "ye have heard," and then he is going to respond to it, and he's going to intensify it, and then he's going to give some practical points about it. And each one of the five, that's kind of the pattern that he gives. The core here is the seventh commandment of the 10 there in Exodus 20 verse 14. This is an exact quote: "Thou shalt not to commit adultery." And this law condemns sexual relationships with someone other than a spouse. The technical meaning of this term would be having a relationship as a married person with someone that is not your spouse, or having a relationship with someone who is married. And the penalty for this sin is death. God designed marriage to end in death. The study that I did on this through your reading, there's so much scripture that it kind of goes into all of this. Just the portions of the law dealing with this are often very graphic, talking about sins that we don't really like the idea of talking about, bestiality and incest and things like that. But that's kind of what's involved in a discussion about this. But the penalty for breaking this law was the offending person was stoned. And that ended the marriage for the person who was not in a sin. I didn't pull out exact quotes, but Wearsby talks through that is the kind of undergirding fact of the way the law views marriage. It ends in death, and so this sin, if they were caught, would end that marriage. That's kind of dark. That's what the law, this is how important this principle is. Marriage is such an important thing. So Jesus responds to it, and in our culture, hearing that, "Thou shalt not commit adultery," well, but what about, what if this person had this happen? And the what ifs in this case many times are just heartbreaking stories. And it's so sad. Jesus takes this law and he reinforces it and makes it more intense and more broad. He says, "But I say unto you that whosoever looketh on a woman to lust after her hath committed adultery with her already in his heart. So just as Jesus did with the one that we looked at last week, he's going to make this about the inner man, those inner intentions and thoughts, and not just about the external actions. So we would say, okay, I have not committed adultery. That sin, okay, that's on that list of, like, in the core meaning of those words and the exact principle of it, you could say, okay, not a problem there. Jesus takes that and says, okay, if you look on in lust, you have committed this same sin. What is lust? A quote from oh, for pity's sake, I didn't put his name in my notes here. And I'm tired enough, I'm not just remembering off the top of my head. I want to say J. Oswald Chambers. Okay, those two names. Oswald is not a normal name anymore, but Oswald Chambers wrote a book that I've been kind of reading along with this. He says, what is lust? The impatience of desire. I must have it at once. Love can wait 7 years, and he's kind of in this portion of the book relating it to Jacob waiting for Rachel. He says lust cannot wait 2 seconds. When I was at Hoops Camp, the years that I was there, this sin is talked about quite often because for young men this is a major problem. I don't know that this is just a young men problem, but for young men specifically in that group we were working with a lot of young men, it definitely is a problem. As a counselor, every time for the next 3 days after this was primarily taught, the discussions in my group, I never had a official cabin necessarily, but my group was, well, what about this? What about this? What about this instance? Like, is this lust? Is this the same sin? And all of this over and over and over again. The general guideline that I presented to them is, if you're pretty sure that if you have a question like that and you're trying to get by to excuse it as not lust, it's almost for sure lust. And you should treat it in that way. And I'm not saying that to be harsh. I'm saying deal with your heart on that instead of trying to excuse that root of a sin. The Bible has a lot to say about lust. For the sake of time, I'm just going to read a couple of verses. James 1, 14 through 16 puts lust in a very important place in seeing what brings into a sin. It says, but every man is tempted when he is drawn away of his own lust and enticed. Then when lust hath conceived, it bringeth forth sin, and sin, when it is finished, bringeth forth death. Do not err, my beloved brethren. And then Galatians 5:24 talks about how we are not bound to that lust. And again, in a context that I hope that you know well, it says, and they that are Christ have crucified the flesh. And it says, with the affections and lusts. So those that are Christ have crucified the flesh with its lust. I will say this about lust. Generally speaking, lust is not just something like you want something that you're disgusted by. Generally speaking, it's wanting something that God has deemed as good in a way that is not good. Right? So it's a way of approach that you are saying, okay, you could look at this in a lot of different ways. A person wanting to be married is not a bad thing, but looking on a person, a man or a woman in lust is a perversion of what God says is a good thing, of what God says is a great thing. So it is that twisting. It is that cause of the fall, that lust of the eyes, that, okay, that fruit was, I'm sure it looked great. I'm sure all of these things, but God had said that's not for you, or that is not for you in other things, that is not for you in that way. So wanting good things and wanting them in the right way is the proper approach. Lust is the perversion of a desire for what is good. And he is saying here that you have committed adultery, this horrible sin, on the sin that when I go through that list of 10 with people, that's often when they say, okay, I haven't done that, right? But Jesus says, if you have even done this internal thing of looking on a woman to lust after her, you have committed adultery with her in your heart. And that in your heart, Jesus is worried about our hearts. And we're going to look at this sin in particular. It carries an impact on who we are as a person, in many ways different and even worse than other sins do. And we will look at that here in a bit, but it has a way of bringing the heart into bondage to that sin. So we've looked at this. Jesus gives us that law. He gives where he is going to intensify that law, and then Jesus is going to give two areas of application and instruction around it. The first one is in verses 29 and 30, and I'm just going to basically say that he says, get rid of the offending member. He says, and if thy right eye offend thee, pluck it out and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. So the right eye there, and it says, if thy right eye offend thee, all right? The idea of the word offend doesn't mean like makes you upset or triggers you. It means to cause to stumble. The implication in a passage like this would be, does that member lead you into sin? Like, is that eye leading you into to sin? So Christ is saying, if you have a problem with your eyes, take your right eye and pull it out and throw it away. Now, let's think about the physical implications of pulling your own eye out. If you were to give up an eye, let's maybe even just remove the thought from this topic particularly. If you were to give up an eye, how many of you would want it to be your right eye? Anyone? How many of you would choose your left eye over your right eye if you were going to lose one? I'm saying, like, in a horrible choice option set, I would pick my left eye over my right eye. All right? Let's go on into the next verse. It says, and if thy right hand offend thee, cut it off and cast it from thee, for it is profitable for thee that one of thy members should perish, and not that thy whole body should be cast into hell. So Jesus is now talking about your right hand. How many people do we have that are left-handed in this room? I think we have a couple. Okay, 2. Okay. I didn't know if we have 2 or 3, depending on who is here. Our church seems to always have a higher percentage than like the national average. That's been the experience of my life. But Jesus is talking about cutting off a right hand. There was a story of a hiker a few years ago who got in a rock slide and his arm was pinned. I can't remember if it was his right or left arm. I'm sure a few of you heard about this. He had a Swiss Army knife and cut off his own arm, like part of his arm, to get free so that he wouldn't die. Okay? When I read this verse, I think, okay, it's a simple thing to cut off an arm. I think I'm not trying to gross anyone out, but think about what would have to go through the process of cutting off even just a hand. All right? So if you are able to sever right at the joints and you're going to try to not take out any bone. This guy had to take out bone when he was hiking. That's a whole different thing. I don't know how he stayed conscious enough to do it. The pain would be horrible. But you'd have to cut through the skin and the muscles and the tendons in a way to get the hand free. I'm pointing to my left hand. I would pick my left hand over my right hand. All right. But you'd have to get through all of those things. That would be a lot of work, right? That would be a bloody, horrific thing. Jesus is saying, pick that option over allowing that hand to allow you into, or to pull you into the temptation of lust, which we just looked at in James as being a direct path into sin, and sin into death. Like that change in a relationship there. This is meant to be a brutal picture. We often just read over it as if, okay, Jesus is saying, we had to talk on our way out to a camp. Jesus is saying, pick the best over the good. Jesus is saying, pick the best option. And he is. But what he's saying is, the best option here is worth extracting your favorite eye and your favorite hand to maintain. This is not a joke in the sense, this shows the importance of this topic to the person that is going to follow Christ. An illustration of this, David's sin began with his eyes. You can look at 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 2, and I'm just going to read a part of it here. It says, and it came to pass at eventide that David arose off his bed and walked upon the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman washing herself, and the woman was very beautiful to look upon. David didn't pluck out his eye. He didn't give up what he was wanting to see there. He went directly, and I want to see more of her. I'm not trying to be funny or gruesome or gory or gross with this, but that ultimately, he did not just turn around and walk away. He did not take a knife to his eyeball. He followed that path down into lust and then to sin, and ultimately people died because of that sin. So that right hand, that right eye, this is a very important, this is a very practical point. What we do, what we choose to look at. There's also a principle in this that is worthwhile practically to kind of go over a bit. We live in a very sexualized age. Advertisements now are often what pornography used to be. But you don't choose what gets thrown in front of your eyes, but you choose what you allow to stay there. You choose what you continue to look at. There is another place for you to look. There is another thing for you to choose. You don't have to give your eyes to look at that, your hands to choose it. Give it up. This is this sacrifice that is meant here. We would associate the right eye and the right hand kind of with that dominant. This would be the valuable part of it. Jesus is saying it's worth it to sacrifice the valuable member. Oftentimes we would choose sight over many other things. We would choose our hands over many other things, right? Again, that's a list of horrible choices. But if we're giving, we have to choose to sacrifice a natural life for the spiritual life. And that's what this gives. And you could look at Romans 12:1, and I have some other things I'm going to just kind of have to skip over here. One place I did want us to see was Romans 6. 19. And Romans 6 talks about this in a broader context of sin. And if you want to turn there, this passage would actually be a good one to learn in any area of sin. But Paul writes in verse 19, he says, I speak after the manner of men because of the infirmity of your flesh. For as ye have yielded your members servants to uncleanness and to iniquity unto iniquity, he's saying this is what you used to yield them to. You used to give your members, your hands, your feet, your eyes, your mouth, your ears to these things which are sin, evil, right? He says, even so now yield your members servants to righteousness unto holiness. And the topic that we're kind of defining here is Christ said, except your righteousness exceed the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, ye shall in no case enter into the kingdom of heaven. Paul is saying you have a choice what you yield your members to. Serve righteousness unto holiness. Sacrifice the natural to the spiritual. Give that stuff up. So that's the kind of the first practical point. Christ is saying in this principle, it's worth the gory comparison of plucking out your own eye and throwing it away, or taking a saw to your favorite hand and throwing it away. And then he goes into another application of this. What about divorce? Going on in verse 31, he says, it hath been said, whosoever shall put away his wife, let him give her a writing of a divorcement. But I say unto you that whosoever shall put away his wife, saving for the cause of a fornication, that causeth her to commit adultery, and whosoever shall marry her that is divorced committeth adultery. Jesus is citing Deuteronomy 24:1, and this is part of a broader context. But that verse says, "When a man hath taken a wife and married her, and it come to a pass that she find no favor in his eyes, because he hath found some uncleanness in her, then let him write her a bill of a divorcement and give it in her hand and send her out of his house." And in Christ's day, that verse became and they ignored some of the broader context of it. What it goes on to say, if that woman, I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, you can go in and read it. That woman, if she goes and marries another man, and that man decides to divorce her too, she can't go back and marry, or if he dies, she can't go back and marry the first man that she married. And the intent there is that there not be the confusion that would cause. And again, it's one of those parts of the law that we kind of just like read through and just kind of like, wow, that's messed up stuff. But the law needed to cover all of this because humanity is kind of messed up. But in that day, in the Christ days, there were two schools of thought on what that verse meant. And it all came down to how you interpreted the phrase, found some uncleanness in her, what that meant. And apparently in Hebrew, they said, okay, that's kind of an ambiguous phrase. What does that mean? So there was one school that said you could divorce her for any reason that you wanted to. That her husband could say, I'm done with you. We're just, this marriage is over. And it would be somewhat like the no-fault divorce that we have in our land now, in a lot of ways. The other school was it had to be because of an issue of sin, and it had to be a provable issue of sin. And again, there's a lot of scripture we could look at in parts of the law that are kind of around this. And so the discussion and the debate was kind of going on around that. And Jesus gives his principle in this. So because there's just so many ways we could ask, well, what if, how about, and all of these things, I'm just going to take you to a passage here in Matthew that discusses this in a little bit more detail and emphasizes the principle that Christ consistently gives. So if you turn with me to Matthew chapter 19, I'm not going to read the whole passage. I would encourage you to if you want to. It would actually be a good to. This is again an issue where divorce without cause, as they're going to ask him about it here in a second, is a part of our culture. Well, we were just no longer in love. Well, we weren't really getting along the way we used to, or my husband, my wife changed so much in the last few years they weren't the same person. These are all excuses that in our culture are just acceptable answers to the question of divorce. Jesus asked there in verse 3, is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for any cause? So he said, is it just okay for them to divorce them for any reason? And they're basically asking him, Jesus, you need to take a side on this. Do you mean it's open to whatever the man wants, or does it have to be some specific issue? Which side of the debate are you going to pick? And Jesus wasn't really interested in taking a side of the debate. What his answer is, as he goes on, it says in verse 4, have you not read that he which made them at the beginning, made them male and a female? And it kind of sets up the principle of what marriage was created to be, not just how the law may have allowed for it to be divorced. Okay, and then look at verse 6. Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God hath joined? What therefore God hath joined together, let not man put asunder. So he's saying this is meant to be a permanent union here. Man is not able to take it apart. And then it goes on, and they say unto him, why did Moses then command to give a writing of a divorcement and to put her away? He saith unto them, Moses, because of the hardness of your hearts, suffered you to put away your wives, but from the beginning it was not so. And I say unto you, whosoever shall put away his wife, except it be for a fornication, and shall marry another, committeth adultery, and whosoever marrieth her which is which is a put away committeth adultery. Doth commit adultery. I'm trying to quote the other verses. So Jesus points out that this allowance in the law is because of the hardness of their hearts. And again, the context of the Deuteronomy passage there kind of shows this. But Jesus then brings again the principle that fornication would be the only cause. So Jesus only allows it in this case, and any other cause for it would be a cause for sin in some way, in a couple of different ways. And then I will point out this too. In the principle of this, what's helpful to realize and kind of point out is this is an allowance, not a commandment. Divorce is not a necessary thing, even if one party in a marriage sins. It's not an instant thing in this age where it's like that marriage is done, it just needs to be over. There is a beauty in that being restored. So the principle here is that marriage is intended to be one man, one woman for life. And that only God can break that up. And any other allowances are allowances because of the hardness of men's hearts. So even in this case, going back to Matthew 5, Jesus' principle, and again, we could spend hours going over how about this and what about that. And again, every story that you're thinking through right now, and every case where this is applied in different ways, is a very real part of someone's life. But to the follower of Christ, what he's trying to get to here is that marriage is not a matter of convenience or personal fulfillment or pleasure in that sense. Marriage must be viewed in the scriptural sense as the picture of Christ and the church, and as a source of happiness and the guard of holiness between a husband and a wife. And that is it. That is the principle there. And those who follow Christ are followers of Christ, even in marriage. So I feel like my voice is getting really weak here. So, bringing this kind of to a close. If you're here and you're saved and you're hearing about this, if you're here and you're not saved and you're hearing about this and you saying, Jonathan, I know that in my thoughts I have committed this sin. You can be right with God still. Christ made the way for you to be saved, and not just saved to be free from the punishment of this sin, but also saved to be free from the power of this sin in your life right now. Please come and see me after church if that's a question in your heart. We looked at for those who are saved. We looked at Romans 6. And we're basically out of time. So there's a lot of other places we could go. This sin carries a lot of weight. Romans 6:13 kind of gives us a little bit of hope in this. Neither yield ye your members instruments of unrighteousness unto sin, but yield yourselves unto God as those that are alive from the dead, and your members as instruments of righteousness unto God. This sin, if it's a problem that you face, if this is a temptation in your life, this sin does not control you. It doesn't own you. If you are a child of God, God has made you alive from the dead, out of the control of this sin and any other sin. And for sake of time, I'm going to just leave it there. But yield yourselves. Make that conscious effort that your eyes, your hand, your mind, your thoughts belong to Christ. Give that active effort to follow him, to seek after him first, to totally cut off any other desire that would take away from following Christ. Let's go ahead and close in a prayer. Lord, I know that this particular sin is such a big part of our culture. Lord, it's a temptation that I imagine every man, probably every human being has faced. Lord, it's one that many yield to at different times and in different ways. Lord, work in our hearts to show us any impurity, Lord, any way that we've gone after this sin instead of going after Christ. Any way that we've chosen to yield to this lust instead of looking for what you would have for us in life. Lord, help us even in this way, even in the thoughts of our hearts, that as we follow you, that our righteousness would exceed the righteousness of the scribes and the Pharisees, and that the control that this sin would have over our lives, our hearts, our thoughts wouldn't be given to it, but that we would be yielded to the work of your Holy Spirit in our lives. In Jesus' name.